What if a single glance could change a life forever? In the rush of everyday life, how many stories go unnoticed around us? Some are obvious. Others remain hidden behind worn-out fences, waiting to be seen. Hugh was one of those stories. Forgotten. Chained. Trapped in a lonely fate. For years, he was nothing more than a shadow, a ghost the world had chosen to ignore. But on a seemingly ordinary day, something extraordinary happened. Someone stopped. Someone looked. And in that single moment, everything began to change. What seemed like just another abandoned dog was, in truth, a survivor. And this is his story. A journey of resilience. Of hope. And of an unbreakable bond, born at a time when no one else believed. Beyond the fence, the world never stopped. Cars rushed down the streets. Children ran and laughed in neighboring yards. People's voices blended with the wind as it whispered through the tree branches. Life was everywhere. But not for him. Behind a worn-out fence, Hugh existed in silence. His world was small, confined to a patch of dry, hardened dirt, where time seemed to stand still. The ground beneath his paws had never known the cool touch of grass, only dust and footprints erased by the wind. The sun scorched his skin in the summer. And in the winter, the biting cold crept into his bones, leaving him shivering through the endless nights. Here, he was nothing more than a forgotten shadow. His only companion was the thick, rusted chain around his neck. Heavy. Unforgiving. It held him captive, granting him only a cruel illusion of freedom. He could move just enough to watch, to witness a world he could never be part of. He saw the lights of homes flicker on at dusk. He heard the sounds of plates and silverware clinking through open windows. He smelled the distant scent of food. But none of it was for him. It never was. The days dragged on, identical to the last. When hunger became unbearable, Hugh would stare at the empty bowl beside him, waiting, without hope, for it to be filled. Sometimes, scraps were thrown his way, dry, careless leftovers. Other times, he waited in vain, his stomach twisting in pain, until sleep and exhaustion overtook him. But deep down, the worst part wasn't the hunger. It wasn't the thirst. It wasn't the fatigue. The worst part was the loneliness. The world around him never noticed he was there. Hugh no longer called out, no longer barked. He had learned that no one would come. No one ever had. His only sounds were the weight of his breath and the clinking of his chain whenever he moved. Time had taught him to give up. But that day, something different happened. Between the hurried footsteps of strangers on the street, someone stopped. It was a simple act, almost insignificant. But it would change everything. Ellie, an ordinary woman, on an ordinary day, let her thoughts drift as she walked. Until something caught her attention. A shadow behind the fence. A barely noticeable movement. And then, two thin, bony paws stretched through a small gap in the old gate. Reaching for something they could never touch. Her heart pounded. A chill rushed through her skin. She didn't know it yet. But in that single moment, she had done something extraordinary. She stopped to look. Days, weeks, and years blurred together, and Hugh no longer knew when it all began. His world was nothing more than a patch of dry earth, confined within the reach of the chain wrapped around his neck. He had never known freedom. Only the constant weight of cold metal against his skin, tightening a little more with each passing day. The summer days brought relentless heat. The sun scorched his skin, burning through his tangled fur, turning his small enclosure into a suffocating oven. The water, when he was given any, evaporated too quickly, leaving him with a dry tongue for hours, waiting for something that rarely came. At night, the temperature dropped, and the cold seeped into his bones. With no shelter, no warm corner to hide in, he curled up into himself, trying to endure the pain of a night that never seemed to end. Hugh no longer remembered what it felt like to be strong. Once, when he was still young, his muscles were firm, his energy boundless. But now, he was nothing more than a shadow of what he once was. His frail body struggled to stand, his skin stretched thin over his bones, covered in wounds from the constant friction of the chain. His coat, once thick and glossy, was now matted, dirty, covered in dirt and scars, each one a mark of the life he had been forced to endure. His owner rarely came. And when he did, he would carelessly toss dry, tasteless food onto the ground, not even sparing a single glance in Hugh's direction. And sometimes, not even that. Days would pass with nothing reaching his empty bowl. Hunger was no longer sharp pain. It had become a constant state, a heavy presence that never left him. But that wasn't what hurt the most. The worst part of all was the loneliness. Hugh hadn't felt the gentle touch of a hand in years. He didn't know what it was like to hear his name spoken with kindness. The world around him kept moving, full of life, full of sounds and scents that were forbidden to him. Beyond the fence, there was a universe he would never belong to. Children ran. People talked. Dogs played with their owners. But for Hugh, all of it was nothing more than a distant echo. A dream that would never be his. At first, he still tried. He howled, calling for something. A sign. A response. Anything. But silence was always the only thing that came back. No one ever answered. Time taught him that it wasn't worth calling anymore. And so, he stopped. He learned to exist without being noticed, a ghost behind the fence. Until one day, something changed. When all seemed lost. When he had given up on calling, on waiting, on believing. Someone finally saw him. Ellie walked slowly along the sidewalk, her thoughts drifting as the wind rustled the leaves above her. It was just another ordinary day, nothing that demanded her attention. But the moment she passed a worn-out wooden fence, something changed. She couldn't explain what made her stop. Maybe it was instinct, a detail her eyes caught without her realizing. Her gaze shifted to a small gap in the wood. Through the narrow opening, a pair of thin, filthy paws stretched outward. As if they were reaching for a world forever out of reach. The sight made her chest tighten. Ellie leaned in slightly, trying to see better. And what she saw on the other side of the fence made her heart race. A dog, thin, exhausted, barely clinging to his strength. Staring into nothing. His body was so frail that every bone pressed against his skin. His matted fur, covered in dirt and neglect, had long since lost its shine. But it wasn't just his appearance that hit her like a blow. It was his eyes. Hugh's gaze lifted slowly. As if even he didn't believe someone was actually standing there, looking at him. There was fear in those eyes. And resignation. A deep weariness that only those who have suffered in silence for too long carry with them. A shiver ran down Ellie's spine. In that instant, something inside her changed. The dog before her was not just one among many. He existed. And she couldn't ignore him.
Will Ellie free Hugh? Before we continue, it's important that you like the video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow more exciting stories like this one.
Ellie's heart pounded in her chest. Something inside her screamed that this moment was crucial. That she couldn't just walk away like so many others had. Hugh's eyes wouldn't leave her mind. A silent plea, trapped in a body that no longer seemed strong enough to hope for anything at all. She grabbed her phone with trembling fingers, typing quickly. Hoping someone would answer. First, a local shelter. No response. Then, an animal rescue service. Calls went unanswered. Time seemed to drag on, while she stared at the frail creature behind the fence. Knowing that every second lost could mean the end for him. She looked around, desperately searching for a solution. She couldn't just leave. Hugh was on the edge, a fading existence that could disappear at any moment. Taking a deep breath, Ellie made her decision. She walked along the fence, searching for a way in. The weathered wood showed gaps in some places. And then, something caught her attention. Near the back of the yard, a few planks had weakened over time, leaving a small opening between the rotting boards and the dry earth. Ellie didn't hesitate. She dropped to her knees on the hard ground, ignoring the dust and scratches as she slipped through the narrow gap. On the other side, the scene was even worse than she had imagined. The yard was filled with rusted metal scraps, abandoned tools, and broken furniture. As if time had stopped there long ago. The smell of rust and dry earth was heavy, suffocating. In the middle of the wreckage, Hugh remained still, as if he had already given up on reacting to anything at all. Ellie stepped forward slowly, her heart racing. She expected him to shrink away, to flinch in fear of her sudden presence. But there was nothing. No attempt to flee. No hesitation. No threatened growl. Just those deep, exhausted eyes, fixed on her. As if he couldn't believe that someone had actually come. The fading evening light cast long shadows around them, as if time itself had been suspended in that moment. Ellie knew she couldn't fail. She had made a choice. And now, it was her responsibility to change his fate. Hugh couldn't spend another night here. She had to save him. And she would. No matter what it took. Ellie's gaze locked onto the chain wrapped around Hugh's neck. The rusted metal had dug deep into his skin, leaving behind raw, painful marks. A silent testimony to the countless days and nights he had spent chained to this small patch of dry earth. Each link in the chain seemed to carry the weight of suffering, of waiting, and of resignation. She stepped forward slowly, every movement filled with caution and urgency. Her eyes scanned the chaotic yard, until she found what she needed. An old bolt cutter, forgotten and corroded by time, half buried among the debris. Ellie grabbed the tool tightly, feeling her heart hammering inside her chest. She took a deep breath. And with a firm, determined movement, she positioned the blades over the thickest link of the chain. The metal groaned under the pressure, resisting for a moment. Then, it snapped with a sharp crack. For the first time in years, the chain that held Hugh captive was broken. But Hugh didn't run. He didn't leap forward. He didn't show joy. He simply collapsed. His frail body hit the ground, sending up a thin cloud of dust. For a moment, Ellie held her breath. Her heart stopped. He lay motionless, his shallow breaths uneven and strained. What should have been a moment of liberation became a moment of sheer panic. Hugh no longer knew what freedom was. His weakened body didn't react. His mind, conditioned by captivity, seemed unable to process what was happening. Ellie dropped to her knees beside him, a wave of fear tightening around her chest. Time felt frozen, as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting to see if this dog still had the strength to go on. And then, a distant sound broke through the silence of the night. Sirens. The red and blue flashes of emergency lights began to flicker in the distance, reflecting against the worn-down walls of the abandoned yard. Help was coming. Ellie lifted her head toward the sound, a lump forming in her throat. They had to be fast. Hugh wouldn't last much longer. The rescue vehicle cut through the silent night, its arrival abrupt and urgent. Red and blue lights flickered against the peeling walls of the abandoned yard. Ellie remained kneeling beside Hugh, feeling the weak warmth still lingering in his frail body. He was breathing. But each rise and fall of his chest seemed like an immense effort. As the rescue team approached, Ellie slowly stepped back, allowing them to take over. The emergency veterinarian touched Hugh's body gently, assessing his condition. His skeletal frame, his dull, matted fur. The open wounds on his neck. Everything pointed to severe neglect. It was a miracle that he was still alive. With extreme care, they lifted him onto a stretcher and carried him to the rescue vehicle, wherein 4-line was quickly inserted into his paw for rehydration. Ellie watched every movement, her heart tightening with fear and hope. The ride to the veterinary clinic was silent, except for the distant echo of the siren through the empty streets. Ellie sat beside him the entire time, a growing dread creeping into her thoughts. What if it was too late? What if, despite everything, he didn't make it? Upon arriving at the clinic, Hugh was taken straight to the emergency unit. His body was too weak to react. The veterinarians worked in silence, focused on stabilizing him. Every minute felt like an eternity. Ellie stood watching from a distance, feeling powerless. Her heart begged for him to have the strength to hold on. The days that followed were filled with intensive care. At first, his breathing remained shallow. His eyes barely able to stay open. His body had to relearn how to accept food. To regain strength, little by little. But even in his extreme frailty, Ellie was there. Every single day, she returned. She sat beside him, spoke softly, letting her presence become something familiar. She told him stories about the world outside, described the blue sky beyond the clinic's windows, whispered that he was no longer alone. He never responded. But sometimes, his ears would twitch slightly at the sound of her voice. And for Ellie, that was enough. It was a sign. A sign that he was still fighting. And then, one day, something changed. As Ellie walked into the room, she stopped abruptly. Hugh was no longer lying motionless like before. His eyes, once empty and distant, were now locked onto hers. Slowly, with visible effort, he moved one of his paws and tried to stand. His body trembled, his legs barely holding his weight. But he was trying. The first step was small, almost insignificant to any other dog. But to Hugh, it was a rebirth. Ellie felt a wave of overwhelming emotion rise inside her. He had chosen to fight. And at that moment, she knew that everything she had done was worth it. Days passed, and each morning at the veterinary clinic became a new test of endurance for Hugh. His body was slowly recovering, his once atrophied muscles now learning to adjust to short, monitored walks. But the most important change wasn't just physical. It was the light returning to his eyes. Little by little, the veterinarians confirmed that he was out of danger. But he needed a home. A safe environment where he could continue healing. Without fear. For Ellie, there was no doubt. She signed the adoption papers without hesitation. Hugh wasn't just a rescued dog. He was a part of her now. The day of his discharge arrived with a mix of excitement and nervous anticipation. Hugh was brought to the clinic's front door, where Ellie was waiting. He hesitated for a moment, looking up at her, as if trying to understand what was happening. Then, with an uncertain step, he crossed the threshold into a new chapter of his life. The car ride was an entirely new experience. The gentle sway of the vehicle, the scent of the upholstery, the sensation of movement. Hugh watched through the window, his eyes wide, taking in a world he had only ever seen through the cracks in a fence. Ellie kept glancing at him, smiling, knowing that this was only the first of many moments of discovery. When they arrived home, Hugh was met with a world completely different from what he had known. No chains. No dry, hardened ground beneath his paws. No merciless cold or blistering heat. Instead, a soft blanket awaited him. A bowl filled with fresh food was ready. And for the first time, he had a real home. In the first few days, he was cautious. He moved slowly through the rooms, always glancing over his shoulder, as if still expecting something bad to happen. But Ellie was there. Always present. Always patient. Over time, he began to trust. He learned that a hand on his head meant affection. That soft words meant safety. That the nights were peaceful. And the days were filled with new possibilities. His coat regained its shine. His steps grew steadier. The expression on his face, once marked by resignation, now carried something new. Hope. And, more than anything, he finally had someone. Hugh was no longer a prisoner of his past. He was a survivor. And, by Ellie's side, he learned what it meant to be loved. Hugh was not just a rescued dog. He was a survivor. His body bore the scars of his past. Visible marks of the suffering he had endured. But now, every step he took was a testament to his strength. His ability to overcome. Ellie hadn't just saved his life. He had saved hers, too. The connection between them grew naturally. A bond that needed no words. Hugh followed her through the house. Laid beside her. And in moments of silence. His presence alone was enough to say everything they had been through together. He had found more than just a home. He had found a place where he truly belonged. Each morning, Hugh stepped out into the yard. Feeling the cool grass beneath his paws. The same sun that had once scorched his skin now felt like a warm, welcoming embrace. Life had finally given him a second chance. And he cherished every moment with silent gratitude. Hugh's story is proof that a simple act of compassion can change lives forever. What began as a glance through a fence turned into a journey of redemption. And unconditional love. And in the end, what once seemed like a mere coincidence of fate became a bond that would last forever.
What an incredible story, isn't it? If you liked it, like the video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to hear more stories like this.